global effort. You have clients all over the world dealing not just with sustainable fisheries, but that's kind of your foundation. And what's so interesting about that in many respects is the issue of how to get buy-in from all the various stakeholders to fisheries issues that are fundamentally common property, tragedy of commons issues, and to get everybody on the same page with respect to that and doing it in a way that is tractable and practical is what I have been so impressed about some of the presentations she's made about really making progress on that intractable problem of sustainable fisheries in our on a global level. So with that, thank you for being here, and I will just say, take it away.
I'm told I have to use this because it's being videoed. So welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us tonight. Cheryl and I are working together as it sounds like many people are now coming to Ojai or are already in Ojai, pitching in to try and address the water shortage and other related issues. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the history of the project, my background. Cheryl's going to talk about her background, and then she'll dive in a little bit more deeply and tell you about the project and where we're at right now and where we hope to head. And then we'll have a little bit of time for questions, if that sounds okay. Yeah? We first came to Ojai in January of 2017. But the first time I ever came to Ojai was in 1976. I spent many, many years living in California, in Los Angeles and the Bay Area. So Cheryl did too, so we're sort of honorary Californians. I'm from Phoenix, so the Southwest in California is much more in my bones than Pittsburgh is, which is where I happen to reside now. I started out as a practitioner. I was a professional designer for many years, ran an international design firm, so I'm not a lifelong academic. I'm actually used to going out there and getting things done. People are always afraid that all academics do is study things and write about them. But I do run the School of Design at Carnegie Mellon now. I jumped over to the academic side about 10 years ago after having gone back to school after becoming very frustrated with what I saw was design's complicity in a lot of the complex, wicked problems that we see in the world. Designers create the built world. Everything that you see in this room tonight, we designed, and often we design it badly. So this coincided very neatly with a midlife crisis, and I thought I'm either going to stop designing or I'm going to find a way to design better that helps create solutions to some of these complex problems instead of making them worse. So I went off and did a master's degree at a Center for Ecological Studies in England called Schumacher College. And from there, I ended up going to Carnegie Mellon University and wanted to redesign the way in which designers were educated that would enable them to pull up to the table with transdisciplinary groups of people working on problems like a water shortage in a community like this one. So we started a thing called transition design, which is really about how designers and other folks from many fields and disciplines can come together to create systems level change and help transition communities towards more sustainable futures. And we have been testing different design-led approaches, and we got to a point where we really wanted to begin to work with a community who was open to trying some of these approaches out. So I was at a national design conference in Las Vegas talking about the approach, and a friend of mine who lives in Ojai came up to me after the conference and said, "We have a really big problem in Ojai. Do you think that this approach you're talking about could help?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. We could come and talk to you. If you've got some interested folks, we could introduce the premise, talk to you about what we might do, and if you're interested, we could take it further." So she said, "Sure, come." So in January of 2017, we came out with a bunch of ad hoc tools. Alex Kim over at the Ojai Inn gave us a room to work in, and we had about I think maybe 25 people. You weren't at the first one. Bill, were you at? Bill was yeah, 25, 30 people. It wasn't about trying to solve the problem. It was about demonstrating the thinking and the principles behind it. And much of it focuses on the need for different stakeholder groups to begin to understand each other, collaborate, not necessarily come to consensus. And Cheryl's going to talk about that more because we're not sure that's ever possible. But how can you learn to create together despite differences and look for areas of alignment? But it's also about getting folks to co-envision a long-term sustainable future that they can agree on. And one of the surprises I think that came out of that workshop, or the second one that Randy was at, was we had different stakeholder groups imagine a long-term Ojai future. Like if your stakeholder group was alive in 2050 and the water crisis had been solved, what would life look like? What would everyday life look like? So we had water experts, and we had residents, and we had people representing farmers. It was very diverse. And you would have expected that their long-term visions would be very, very different and reflect the differences that, different stakeholder groups have today. But actually, there was much more agreement and commonality about those long-term visions than we ever expected there to be. So part of the approach says this long-term visioning, this future space, may be a space in which we can create and transcend our differences in the present, and we can backcast from that future and figure out a way to get there. Because part of the problem is we often don't know where we want to go. We know we got a problem now, and we need to move from where we are now, but we don't have a common idea of where we want to go. So that was one of the things that we did in the workshops. So we have been trying to figure out, in the absence of funding, how Carnegie Mellon and the city of Ojai could work together. Well, as we were developing transition design, I happened to be at a conference in San Francisco, and Cheryl was giving a talk on the amazing work she's been doing with global overfishing. And I went up to her afterwards and I said, "You're doing transition design. So we've been developing tools and approaches, but you're actually doing it." So I harangued her long enough that she agreed to start working together, and she's now an adjunct professor on my faculty. So we began to coalesce this whole thing over the summer, and after the Thomas fire, I think the sentiment here shifted a bit. So we've been able to develop a memorandum of understanding with the city of Ojai and Carnegie Mellon University, and we'll talk a little bit more in depth about our efforts for fundraising and some events that we hope will be on the horizon and what we hope in the coming months will bring. But I think I'll turn it over. Well, I've sort of talked a little bit about what transition design is, so I'll turn it over to you.
So when Terry and I met and she said, "You're doing transition design," that was really good news to me because I didn't know there was a name for what I was doing. And if you ask the people who I was trying to persuade to fund me or working with what I was doing, they would say things like, "You're crazy and that will never work." So transition design was a real upgrade in terms of capturing what I thought I was trying to accomplish. I spent about 10 years working on ending global overfishing, and that journey took me to Indonesia and Chile and Peru and places all over the world to work in fishing communities or to work with technology companies creating services for the fishing industry, or distributors who are packaging fish and shipping it all over the world. So it was trying to figure out, how do you get a supply chain with very different perspectives on what is of value, right, and what is necessary in the world and what the ocean means to them, to rein in their take of the fish and transition us to a more sustainable future with an ocean that has fish still in it, right? So that work has been endlessly challenging and interesting and has given me a really good sense of how to work in communities where there's lots of conflict and where there's lots of differences of opinion, and how you can move through that to get to a place of creativity. So I think Terry told you a little bit about what transition design looks like. How do we get that done? What does it look like in practice? So life may be like a box of chocolates, but transition design is like a hamburger. So there's a couple different pieces to this. We have a process that people would consider to be the meat of getting stuff done, which is a solutions process. That involves research, where we look at the world and understand where has this problem been solved in other places? What are the insights from those solutions that would help us design in a smart way? And where are the patterns and how people have solved this, right? We also do a section of research which is called ethnography. So we send researchers into the field to meet with different stakeholder groups, and it's kind of like, it's observation. So they're like a fly on the wall, hanging out with particular stakeholders, watching them do things in the community, seeing how they interact with their family. We kind of put people under a microscope to better understand, what does it look like to walk in the shoes of that person? What is their perspective? And how does understanding that make us smarter about how to design a process that has something of self-interest for them, right? This process then moves to a design stage where a lot of folks with ideas come together, and then we ultimately raise money to incubate some of those ideas. One of the most important things about this solutions process is that the designers are not Terry and me or professional designers. The designers are you, right? Design is nothing more than creating things with intention, and you all do that all the time. What we want to do is take the community and make you the center of the creative energy, because you are the ones who live here, and you're going to be here long after anyone who comes for an engagement is going to be around, right? So there are entrepreneurs in your community, there are water experts in your community, there are people who have enormous talents. We feel very privileged to be in a community with so many smart and contributing brilliant folks. That's why you belong at the center of this process, right? In addition to that, though, one of the key things about what's hard about collaboration is that we get in our own way, right? We wind up repeating bad patterns of interacting with people, or lacking the skill sets to behave in ways that help us be collaborative, right? So there are pieces that are around this solutions process that help make a full meal of this engagement. One of them is vision, which Terry described for you, and the power of that, as she said, is this ability to look out into the future, and by doing that, bypass a lot of the initial conflict that typically is the way we meet and discuss things. So I just like to say that we convene not on behalf of consensus, getting everyone to agree, but on behalf of creativity. And if you think about it, we usually do the opposite. We usually convene, come together, and we think we have to agree about everything before we can move forward, right? And you can actually hold a lot of diverse ideas in a solutions process if you just understand that there is not one solution, nor is there just one strategy, right? We're not trying to get to a competition of the one thing that's going to solve this problem, because I'll tell you, one thing won't, right? What I've seen in more than 10 years of doing fisheries work, and another 7 on top of that of studying social entrepreneurship as a journalist writing about it, is that it takes a whole portfolio of solutions to solve complex problems. That means we have to develop lots of different approaches. So the good thing is that means that you don't have to change what you think or what you're passionate about to be part of the solution, because there's lots of them, right? The other piece of this is that we are typically have difficulty figuring out how to engage civically, right? There aren't a lot of great paths for that. We know what voting looks like, but the processes that are set up publicly for there to be collaboration are often perfunctory. There's a public hearing, and the decision may already have been made. That's what happens in Chicago a lot. Or there isn't a sense of invitation or enfranchisement. People don't show up because they don't necessarily feel welcome, right? So what does it look like to have a really rich and collaborative process? Well, part of what it looks like is that we actually need to listen a lot more than we talk, right? And we also need to develop a deep understanding or respect for other positions in the community. So we can actually hold space for not a civic engagement that feels like being a consumer. I bought this, I want it this way, and here's what my interests are. But a place where you can hold space for other voices and being part of something that isn't all about you, right? So to build those skills and to develop that kind of leadership, there's a whole part of our process that involves taking cohorts of people in Ojai through adaptive leadership training and through training about equity and empathy, right? So this would be a group of people from the community who would say, I want to be a leader who is living these principles and can teach others how to do it, right? So those two things make this process far more effective. This is pretty linear, and we will do parts of it repeatedly. Once we get to a place where we do design workshops, we can cycle that all day long as we get funds for it. But these two pieces will be ongoing, and the vision of this will begin as a true north, and then it'll keep getting iterations as new people join the conversation. So one of the first questions people typically ask is, isn't Ojai completely unique? I mean, I know you've worked in other communities, but we have serious problems, or we can't get along, or whatever the fill in the blank is around what you see as being unique. And I think the amazing mix of culture and people and ideas is a lot of what people talk about too, that there are artists and there are all kinds of practitioners from different fields who have landed here and have lots of skills and abilities to contribute. So I would say, yes, Ojai is unique, but it is also similar to every other place that we've worked, because at the end of the day, systems are about people, right? And we can talk all day long about the technical solutions to a water problem or the technical solutions to affordable housing. But at the end of the day, it's all about social dynamics and how people behave and how we can work together to solve our problems collaboratively. And those dynamics are pretty similar, right? There are cultural contexts for those, and the iterations look different in different communities. In Lombok Labuhai in Indonesia, we ended up doing ethnography there to understand how the situation would work for fishermen if they wanted to adopt technology. So this was a place where there were artisanal fishermen going out on very small boats for long excursions, handline fishing for tuna. So that is literally you're pulling in the string, the line with your hands. And these are giant tuna. The tuna are often half the size of the boat that the fishermen are on, right? So these are folks who don't have smartphones. They have flip phones for the most part. And not a lot of technology, and not big boats with GPS. This is a really dangerous situation for fishing. And one of the local nonprofits wanted to give them life vests because a lot of the fishermen actually can't swim. And so they raised money and they bought a life vest for every fisherman who was in that artisanal fishery. It was something like 110 life vests. They gave them out to the fishers. And the first thing that the fishermen did was to lash all of the life vests together to create what's called a fish aggregation device. It's basically a playground for fish. You float something in the water that creates some shade underneath, and then the fish hang out there and lay their eggs, and that turns into like a little nursery for fish. Because then you've got the place you want to fish, because that's where all the fish are gestating. But they had no interest in making themselves safer. They didn't have an interest in the loss in status of the weakness of putting on a life jacket and not looking macho to your fellow fishermen. The culture didn't allow them to do that, right? And so the way we learned that about them was by hearing their story, right? So we're going to learn Ojai's story and learn the unique things about your culture and the subcultures within your culture and all the stories that make Ojai unique and also make the individuals within the community have different motivations, right? And so when we do that, we'll be able to help you navigate differently. So what's in this for us? Do you want to talk about CMU?
Yeah, I get asked this a lot. So why is Carnegie Mellon spending money to subsidize us coming here and continuing to work with you? And people are always like, why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? And I say, well, the great thing I have found about being in academia is I have a day job. I teach, but I also get to do research. And my passion is educating successive generations of designers to design way differently than I did, and design differently than a lot of designers do now, with earth ethics as a basis, with the idea of going beyond human-centered design, which is the big buzzword in design right now, but actually thinking about systems and ecosystems in particular, and a generation of designers that will think about what it means to re-inhabit a place in a meaningful and more appropriate way. So toward that end, I led the project to redesign all of the programs in the School of Design at the undergrad, master's, and doctoral level, and we put design for society and the environment at the heart of everything. And we launched a doctoral program in transition design. So we need actual real-world projects in order to develop new design curricula and new design approaches. Design is not one of those disciplines where you can just do theory and write about it. It's not design unless you're making stuff, unless you're actually doing things in the world. So Ojai is a community that has been generous enough to say, if you'll step into the community and work with us, then we will do it with you. What we learn here will be written about. We will disseminate very honestly about what's working and not working, not only to take it back into the classroom, but to hopefully share it with other communities around the world. So part of the art of the research we're doing is what is unique about Ojai? How can we develop approaches that work for this particular community? But then how can we analyze what is universal and translatable and scalable to other parts of the world so that other communities can then take the learning from this place and reinterpret it for their own place? Because think about it, if we can figure out an approach together that will allow an extremely diverse community like Ojai to actually begin to collectively transition toward futures that you want, that's big. That keeps me getting up every morning. That's what I care about. So being able to work with this community and honestly say, we're learning this didn't work, now we're trying that, and write about it, that's what's in it for Carnegie Mellon. And my dean is totally on board with this. So the fact that we actually have the leadership at Carnegie Mellon helping a community transition, or maybe more appropriately, helping empower a community to transition toward the future they want, that's what universities ought to exist to do, and it's rarely that they get to do it because they're chasing funding for other kinds of things. So Cheryl will talk more about how we hope to raise funding for the projects that will help. But we also aspire to track what's already going on. You know, I think sometimes there's concern that, oh, you guys want to come in and own it all. Absolutely not. The metaphor I used in a conversation today, so to mix hamburger metaphors with other metaphors, I often say transition design is a little bit like acupuncture, and I bet you we got folks in here that have done acupuncture before. Yes? If I ask that in Pittsburgh, I get blank looks. So acupuncture is similar because you basically have a complex system that has fallen out of balance and needs to transition back into health. And so the acupuncturist is intervening in the system along meridians with the needles in order to put a needle in. There's an intervention. I'm going to observe how the system reacts, and based on that, I'm going to intervene again. And so this is essentially the way you begin to transition a community, through designed interventions at different levels of scale over different periods of time. So in that way, there's many initiatives and projects that are going on here right now that are fantastic. We do aspire to help map those. If we can begin to create a map of the whole system, to say where are the needles already placed in the body, And where are there gaps? Where are new ones needed in order to shift the system? We might be fundraising for some of those needles, but other people will be fundraising for others. And I think this is hopefully the beauty of the approach, in that nobody's trying to own anything. We're just trying to understand the system to see perhaps how things can be connected up for greater traction, but moreover, where are there gaps? Where are there opportunities for more interventions?
So what's in this for Ojai? I would say, first of all, the fact that a university gets involved and has a whole practice around capturing lessons and disseminating makes it much more appealing for foundations to fund the work, because they're not getting not just the impact of what they're funding in one community, but they're also getting publishing and lessons and lots of things that could apply in other places. So there's a scale to the effect that they can have, right? The other thing is that, this is going to be leaders in your community contributing ideas and moving forward with them. We provide a facilitated container that's going to make that run more smoothly, have access to more resources, both in terms of funding, but also in terms of network, right? Because some of what we provide is a service where we find partners or other team members for new ventures, as well as kind of new nonprofits, right? So there's a way in which you're doing the same activities you'd be doing. There will be some new ones as well that come out of this process, and you're doing it in a place where someone is supporting you in the process, right? So ideally, what that means is that there are more solutions in the world and more activity and more impact happening. The other piece of this is that the way that I've set up this process in fisheries, there's a part of it that is the work that we do, which is some research and running workshops and kind of holding this process. And then there's launching solutions in the world. And typically what we've done is we raise money for our process, but we also raise money for incubation. And all of that is passed through funding. We don't touch it, right? So typically the way this has worked is that the amount of funding that I have raised for groups that I'm launching and supporting is 4 to 7 times more than what I spend on what we do, right? So it depends on the project and what the scale is of the implementation, but we are not here to make money off of Ojai's problems, right? My company is called Flip Labs, and it is a for-profit company, but it is what's called a B corporation. And what that means is that I go through a certification process every 3 years and demonstrate that my company has a social mission. And what that means is that I'm saying to the world, I'm not about making profit or delivering profit to any shareholders that are part of my company, right? I also have a nonprofit division, which works nicely because foundations typically prefer that their money goes through a nonprofit as opposed to going to a for-profit company. The only reason Flip Labs isn't a 501c3, an official nonprofit, is that I didn't want to have a board and manage them. That takes time. I just didn't have the energy for that. But what I've tried to do is build a flexible platform that allows me to act with integrity and do amazing work and really not worry about the container. What's in this for me personally is that I like to say that I work on near impossible problems with extraordinary people, right? And all of you sitting here are the extraordinary people. What has drawn us to this community is absolutely the talent and the passion of all the people that we've met who are already giving us great ideas and showing up to meetings like this to just learn about the process. So it's a privilege to potentially be able to move forward in this process with you. So we have made some progress since I was last here, end of July, beginning of August. So first off, we have identified 29 foundations that we think are good fits for this project. We spent money on a firm, Carnegie Mellon paid for us to do a search to find funders that would be likely matches for this project. So we have this prospecting list. It was approved last week by Carnegie Mellon because we needed to make sure there weren't any conflicts in us trying to raise money from places that other departments were raising money. And so that fundraising process is going to begin essentially next week when we get back to our respective offices. We have also already submitted for a state grant in partnership with some local entities here in Ojai. Our role in that state grant, which is roughly $2 million, would be to help facilitate a conversation among the various water boards to get to a framework or for a strategy moving forward, and then also to communicate to the community. So there's a bunch of pieces there about storytelling, a bunch of pieces there about water literacy, and that would be something that we would work on. So that hits some of that hamburger process in the meaty middle that I talked about earlier. We've also started to do research. So in a typical engagement, if I weren't engaged with Carnegie Mellon, that would be a client service, and we've done about $50,000 worth of research so far, and it has cost you exactly $0 because by working with CMU, I have had some graduate students working with me. And so what we've done is assess globally what are all the water scarcity solutions that are relevant to Ojai. And we've got two different groups. One is solutions launched by social entrepreneurs. The other are solutions that are kind of governance related, so they're kind of water management strategy at a municipal level. And we've already learned some really interesting insights about how those problem solvers have approached those challenges. They look different in different places, but the interesting part is that everywhere you're talking about water issues, you're talking about human beings. And in every place where you're talking about water issues, you need to persuade people to do something different, right? And so every one of those projects has an insight into how do you move people, right? And all of those insights are going to come wrapping back into this work. So we are about 70% done with that research project, which is the first phase of this work. And we hope to have it completed before we even land any money. What was there's something else that we did. We've started a database of organizations in Ojai that we've had connections with, and a newsletter that goes out to all of you as well. If you haven't signed up for that, please do. There's a sign-up sheet over there. Yeah, and that is the progress update. We're gonna start fundraising next week. We are hopeful that we are able to bring some funds to the table within about 3 months. And that state grant we will hear in March, and then the funds would land in June, right? So that would be the timeline for those activities. So what's next is a lot of fundraising and trying to make this work possible. But the other thing that's next is that we're trying with a very small budget and not a lot of woman power, because it is all woman power at the moment, to get things done like this research project without spending money, and to do things effectively to get this in motion before we actually have funding. So some of that has been trips out here to just talk to people. And what we're starting is this list of organizations and people. And every time we come out here, we meet amazing people. And then they give us the name of 5 friends. And then those 5 friends give us the name of 5 more friends. This is how we're going to actually learn the community and learn where the resources are to make this work really powerful. And so I would say anyone who's willing to share references or recommendations of people we should get in touch with, please do. Because I've got a long list, and we're working through it and basically reaching out and making phone calls or setting up meetings when we're here and really trying to understand what's the nature of the work that's already happening, what kind of assets already exist in this community, and how do we roll them into this process in a way that feels powerful. The second thing is that we will be communicating more about what it looks like to work on the 2 bun pieces of the hamburger. But we are going to try to raise money to do some significant what's called capacity building in Ojai. And it is about those muscles of empathy and equity and figuring out how to be part of a visioning process. So there will be opportunities for people here to sign up to do a series of workshops with us. And what it might look like would be 2-day workshops over a period of 18 months and maybe doing 3 of them. Right? But it would also mean taking a leadership role in the community and figuring out how might you share some of the lessons of what you learn with other people in Ojai, right? So if you think you might be interested in that, or you think you know someone who might be interested, it'd be great if you could start letting us know. We are still inventing the process by which we will figure out who's going to be able to do that, and that also has to do with scoping the project and figuring out how much money and how many positions we will have available. But we wanted to let people know that that kind of involvement would be a possibility, so you can share your interest if you have it.
So I'll just talk about some next things that might go on at Carnegie Mellon. So we're hoping to be able to create a project website soon. That is something I do have capacity for. We want to make it bilingual. And it is just the two of us sort of working on this with some master's students. So I'm hoping it'll be up in a few months, but we'll certainly let you know that. I'm hoping it's going to be a place where the wider community can come to get updates, but we're also trying to figure out if we might have capacity to actually gather feedback and do some anecdotal research as well. The other thing I just want to mention is my role is going to be changing. So I am in my 10th year as the head of the school, and I'm a tenured professor, so I do have a job for life, thank goodness. They can't step me down into retirement, because I don't want to retire. But my role is going to change. So as of May, I'm going to have a year sabbatical, and I plan to point a lot of that sabbatical at Ojai. And the dean has invited me to create a transition design institute at the college level, not the school level. For those of you that aren't academics, you don't probably get, that's kind of a big deal. They don't start college level entities lightly, and so it's an amazing show of support from Carnegie Mellon to think that transition design is important enough. We inaugurated a new president on Thursday, and in his inaugural speech, he mentioned 3 important research strands at Carnegie Mellon, and transition design was one of them. And they all know that Ojai is at the center of that. So I feel really excited that the university at the top levels are aware of the work that we're doing here, and they're completely behind it. That's a big deal. The other thing that's nice is since we launched the transition design approach in 2014, we now have 14 universities around the world that are either teaching it or have created research strands in it. New Zealand, Australia, Colombia, Argentina, Mexico, Norway, Sweden, the UK. So it's really spread, which means the more traction this gains, the easier it will be to raise money and create academic partnerships. We already have folks at Wellington University in New Zealand who want to do a partnership. They'd like to start a project in Wellington like Ojai. So I think the more connections we can build like this, the better it is for a community like Ojai. We just the other day had the Dean of Sociology at UC Santa Barbara reach out. He heard about the work going on in Ojai and wanted to know if there was an opportunity for his students to get involved. So I think we're meeting with him on Thursday. And the good news there is they've got anthropologists and sociologists. So we're really hoping that this is going to gain traction. We can get students involved. We have a doctoral program in transition design. We're hoping that maybe by next year we'll have funding available to advertise for a doctoral student that we could attach to Ojai full-time. Now, all of this is what's on the drawing board, but we're excited.
Questions? Do you want to?
Oh, here. No, don't.
Thanks, Cheryl. So I just wanted to put a little reasoning behind why they're here from my personal perspective. I got to be in their group 2 years ago, and as a council man or a council person, we run into a lot of interesting problems in our community. And what I saw was how a community can divide itself over these issues. When I attended their class, or for the 3 days, I walked away from it saying to myself, that's the way you need to govern. You need to figure out how to build consensus with all of the little fractions or factions that you have in your community. And they showed it to me clearly. And I walked away from that process 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, just overwhelmed with what they could bring to a community and how to help us solve our small problems. Now, I got selfish in the first couple of times that they've been here talking about the MOU is between them and City of Ojai. And I've been since convinced, rather thoroughly and easily, that this is about our entire community. And when we talk about watershed and we talk about water sustainability and we talk about water resiliency, we can't just talk about Ojai anymore. We've got to talk about all of this valley. And again, they have the expertise and they have the solid backing of a major university. And they just have, these two women are just incredibly well-educated, are thoughtful, I mean, they're everything that you would want to help guide you and lead you. And I'm so happy you're here. Incredibly happy. And I'm happy that you're here, because this process can't work without us. It cannot work without us. And that's the most important part of it. It's the same way government can't work without us. If we're engaged, we're going to solve these problems to the best of our ability. If we're not engaged, we're going to allow someone else to do it, and we may not like the result. At least buy in and be a part of it. That's what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Gary, can you tell us more about the $2 million grant? What was the entity that wrote that, and what portion of that goes to this process?
So that was the Watershed Progressive group that initiated the kind of constellation of 23 different organizations in Ojai region that are part of this. I honestly can't name off the top of my head all the applicant group is a nonprofit that is part of the alphabet soup of acronyms of water boards. So I'm sorry I don't have that off the top of my head. So that piece, I'm not sure what our percentage is. What I submitted to them was a budget, and I understand that some tweaking happened before the grant was submitted. We are scheduled to have a meeting to talk through what changes had to happen before the grant got submitted. Our portion of it is fairly small. I think because we're doing more the communication part, there are 12 water projects in Ojai that are going to be planned for. So we're kind of like this much of that much of a budget. It's probably less than 20%. So.
It's many projects for Ojai.
Yeah.
Which is really
Thank you very much, and congratulations on what you're creating here. And I would suppose it's a privilege for Ojai to also be selected to be the center of your vision, or an aspect of it. My question is: have you basically open to or identified other disciplines that you want to bring to bear in the service of the overall process and intention? And also, have you dealt with the issue of timing in terms of the urgency around some of these previously intractable problems?
Well, good questions all. I'll respond and then let Cheryl. Transition design always assumes that any complex problem is going to require many different disciplines and professions and people from all walks of life coming together and collaborating over it. We think that the disciplines required are going to be unique to the interventions that get mocked up. So I think that there will be solutions in the built world, which might involve engineers and architects. There will probably be some solutions that have to do with ecosystem restoration, or perhaps, transitioning lawns or green spaces from back to indigenous species, and that would involve another constellation of specialists. So I envision that lots of different people will be coming into this. It's design because of its intentionality. It's not that designers are going to be solving this problem. So in that respect, design, we are defining after Herb Simon, a Carnegie Mellon professor, that design is really changing existing situations into preferred ones. And therefore, we're all designing an intentional transition to climate resiliency. So I think the high-level answer is lots of different ones that will probably be determined as we fundraise for different initiatives. I have a futurist on my faculty. I'm so convinced that this visioning process is part of the key that I brought a futurist named Stuart Candy on board. And if you Google him, you'll see a couple of very nice TED Talks that he's given. So he's somebody that's definitely going to be involved in the top bun part. But I'm going to let you respond to the rest of that.
So I agree with and would echo Terry's statement about some of the disciplines will be determined by the specific ideas and ventures that come to the table in the design workshops. I will guarantee you we will bring finance people to the table. Every single issue that I've worked on, finance is key to figuring out how you scale anything and how you think differently about problem solving, because you can get access to capital differently. The other thing you asked about was kind of urgency, and you're like, I can imagine hearing that we're starting fundraising now, that money's landing in March, when it's like, wow, the clock is ticking on water scarcity and running out. So one of the things about transition design is that the actual process and project management is what we call emergent, meaning that everybody who I pull in to work on these types of teams is very used to, nothing ever looks like a blank slate, and you don't get to have things be perfectly symmetrical. What happens is you land in a project where lots of people have already been working, and you figure out how to run alongside them and catch up, right? And so we are going to work as fast as we can to support people who are already leading this work here, right? So the solution isn't waiting on us. We're going to catch up to the solution makers and amplify what they're doing. So, yeah. Any other questions?
I think,
Very fascinating process. Do you have some vague or maybe specific milestones you look at down the road to give you an indication as to whether you're making progress or getting traction in the process or the solutions?
So those are sort of system specific. I can share some of the things that we measured in fisheries. We ended up deciding that the areas of intervention in the fisheries system were about traceability technology. So that's technology in a supply chain that allows you to capture data about product that's moving and couple it with the product so it stays with it. The reason that's an issue in fisheries is that over a third of seafood that you eat is mislabeled. It isn't the fish you think it is or didn't come from where it says it came from. So this has to do with bad technology, bad practices, a bunch of stuff that needs to get fixed. But we decided we're going to focus on traceability technology and getting that implemented at more seafood companies. So what we looked at as a measurement was market penetration for traceability technology. We also looked at amount of money spent by the philanthropic community funding traceability projects in the NGO world as a sign of a tipping point. So when we started our work on traceability in 2008, we literally were laughed out of a room because we said technology was important, and everyone else was like, that isn't it. Nobody cares about that. That's not part of the barrier to sustainability. And within 5 years, the funding rate of the big three foundations that fund fisheries work was over $25 million going out to NGOs to work on this issue. We were not getting, obviously, all of that money, but what we had managed to do was, through our storytelling and our lobbying with the foundations and educating them, managed to push a tipping point of where there was attention and focus on that issue, right? So I think we're going to have to come up with what the right metrics are for various projects here. I would also say that one of those metrics has to measure what does it feel like to be an Ohioan, right? Because one of the things we heard when we came back after the Thomas fires was that there was this sense of camaraderie and a sense of community and a sense of caring that happened in the wake of that disaster that touched people, reawakened in them what was special about the community, and was something that they deeply appreciated. And I think one of the things that we need to figure out is, what would it look like for that to feel like every day in Ojai, for those connections to be that deep, for there to be a sense of community that penetrates every day. How we measure that and how we figure out how people can feel that is, I think, a question. But I think one of the aspirations here is that, yes, you solve some really complex problems, but in doing so, you become a different community, right? You learn to work with each other and be collaborative in a way that when we're gone, you won't need us, right? That should be the ultimate goal.
I was telling somebody earlier today that trying to develop an approach, and I always use the word approach, not process. Complex problems, everyone is different. There are similar principles, but you can't develop a linear process to solve a complex problem. So you have to use guiding principles to get to where you go, and you have to invent on the fly. So anybody heard the legend of the ship of Thebes? It was being rebuilt even as it was under sail. So part of the art of doing this work, not just for us, but all of us, is trying to develop the metrics. And I think place as much importance on qualities as quantities. And that's often very challenging in a university. I happen to be in a qualitative discipline, but on the other side of campus, you know, unless you can measure it and parse it, it doesn't count. But if you happen to go onto the transition design seminar website that I think is on the little transition design card, you'll see the transition design framework, and there are 4 areas that we call areas of knowledge aggregation. And they're things we think are important in terms of understanding systems dynamics and anatomy and helping to shift systems. But I think the most important area of the framework is mindset and posture. We always say to the students, in order to do this work, you have to have a certain amount of self-reflection. You know, you can't lead with ego. You have to be willing to listen instead of waiting to talk. You have to pull up to a table ready to change your mind. And these postures and mindsets lead to imagining different paradigms, because we also argue that the socioeconomic political paradigms we're embedded in right now are inherently unsustainable. So part of what we want to transition to are new ones. You know, we want to reimagine lifestyles. We hopefully want to be embedded in an economy that exists to help us meet our needs, not the other way around. So changing our mindsets and the way we are with each other, I think, is fundamental to doing this. And yes, we have to also track quantities and things that are measurable. We have to measure them. And academia demands that rigor if we're going to publish about it. But I think that other piece comes first and is more important.
Always love listening to you guys. It brings out questions in my own mind, and I'll probably betray my own weakness from my, academic past. My wife's always talking about, get off your linear thinking, Bill. One of the eye-opening books that I read years ago was called Analysis Without Measurement, and it's fascinating. Very rigorous tome about analysis without measurement. And so one of the things I wanted to ask you about was, and it just occurred to me, and especially with the gentleman's question about operating with different experts and disciplines, is of course the problem is disciplines tend not to have ability to work with one another in a consistent paradigm. They don't know how to talk to one another in various, you know what I'm talking about. Is transition design pedagogy actually addressing the issue of how to translate a consistent paradigm across different disciplines, across different experts, across different, analysis? Is that part of what you do, is to try to develop that as part of your pedagogy?
Well, yeah, in my day job, that's exactly what I'm trying to do. I'm not going to be talking about that much in work in Ojai, but because we absolutely believe that solving complex problems is about transdisciplinary radical collaboration? Absolutely. And there's a lot about that on our seminar website. So our transition design seminar, we have students from across the university, and they're all sitting in a room together. Now, I have to say, the thing that makes them take our class, which is not required, it's an elective, is they already have interest in playing with other people. And most of them also have an interest in figuring out how some of the world's bigger problems are going to get addressed, because we're not going to be, many of us in the rooms are not going to be the ones that see them cracked, but all of my students are going to be around to see those things play out. And so we're seeing an amazing wave of students that is already predisposed to work together. We try to teach them to dance. I think of it as a dance. Anybody in here do the tango? I've had, yeah, badly. Me too, really badly. But I think it's a great metaphor, because the thing about the tango is you are dancing with somebody else, but leadership and followership is being handed off invisibly through tiny little signals. And I always say to my students, you have to develop the ability to know when you're speaking from the center of your expertise and when you are not. And when you are not, you have to step back and hand it off to somebody else. But the group also has to recognize and acknowledge this has never been done before. We've been really good at creating the problems, and we haven't yet figured out how to solve them. So there are going to be times in a group where nobody knows what to do. So then you have to take up a different posture. You're not the expert. And the university rewards people often for being experts. So a lot of this is about knowing when, okay, I can be damn sure that that letter spacing right there is bad. It's really bad. But that hardly matters. There's nobody that is an expert about how to transition Ojai toward climate resiliency. So you have to be in more of a speculative conversation. These students who are showing up are the leaders in understanding how to get out of their disciplinary silos and play with other folks. And our hope is they're kind of like the Trojan horses. We send them back into their departments with subversive agendas, you know? And that's what we're all trying to do. But that is a very tough line to walk. We all have expertise that we leverage to make a living with. And hey, I love my core discipline, which was really typography and information design. But I'm pretty far afield from that now. But sometimes I use it. So these students, for me, Bill, it's more about developing that mindset and that posture than actually teaching an engineer how to collaborate with a philosopher. If you are operating with those principles, you will figure it out, because you fundamentally believe that two heads are going to be better than one. That's really what it's about. I want to learn to play better with other people.
Just very quickly, thank you so very much. I'm hopeful about the water issue probably for the very first time. And all I can say is that it would be wonderful to have your expertise and to know even the research you mentioned about what's happening in different parts of the world. We don't have that capacity. And that is going to be so valuable for you to inform us so that we can make better decisions. Anyway, I'm just very excited about it, and I wanted to thank you very much for choosing Ojai.
Thank you. Maybe you could talk about that research parsing and what it will yield with some of the patterns.
Yeah. So we'll be happy to share it. And I think the part that we're looking for is this is an analytic method that is qualitative that I developed when I worked for a nonprofit called Ashoka. And essentially it's looking at social entrepreneurs and working backward from what they've invented to understand what their solution implies about the nature of the problem and the nature of what can solve it, right? So you're looking for the barriers to solving it and then also the design principles. So by looking at 20 solutions or 50 or 100 of them and looking for patterns in the insights that are not always explicitly made, you wind up being able to see where there's are powerful alignments in thinking. So an example of that is with all of these solutions around water scarcity. Some of them are in urban cities, some of them are in rural places in developing countries. But one of the things that almost all of them do is in thinking about how to educate people about water in the community and change the way that water is managed, groups are deputized to become either folks who go out in the community and talk about water, or people who gather meter readings, or people who actually manage a piece of water technology in places where they've done distribution of taking the technology and actually putting it out in rural areas. So there's a way in which empowering people with a part of the message winds up being part of the solution. What's also interesting about that is almost unilaterally across those solutions, the people who are picked to do that work and deputized are marginalized groups in the community.
I do have a question about that.
Mm-hmm.
So water in particular is a really complex problem because it's not only just like from a physical standpoint, how do you create the solutions? You have a lot of legal issues that are very different from county to county, not even nation to nation. Like just even from here to the next county, extremely different laws and regulations, and even more different between states. So looking, and even infrastructure management and looking at how do you get the different permits for everything is all really different. So how do you integrate that into looking at global solutions into the local solutions?
Yeah, which is why what we're looking for are principles, not actually technologies or specific strategies. So the implementation of these solutions look different in different places because of exactly the things that you mentioned. There's also cultural context, there's also economic context, there's different things that are wind up being a specific part of a specific challenge in a location. Some of what we're looking for with the design principles are where are there universal ideas about human behavior and what works when you're trying to get people to change, and that's what's present in those solutions.
So here's one more question, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're thinking about from a social psychology standpoint, and you're looking at, say, a community that has prevalent wealth in part of it, so people have different interests and ideas and goals versus a developing nation where people are walking 2 or 3 miles to get their daily water rations. How do you transect that global divide?
Right, so not all the solutions come from developing countries. What we're looking for, again, are principles that could cross those kinds of differences.
You know, one thing I just wanted to mention apropos of your question, we've got some of these cards up here, and the very first website that's listed on the back is a transition design seminar website. So the entire course is up online because people around the world teach with it. And some of it, you know, goes deep and it's a slog of a read. But some of it, we have an additional resources tab, which is filled with videos and diagrams and things that, you know, it's an easy way in. And I think hopefully it's just an interesting collection of things on the topics of systems level change that you might enjoy. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
Thanks. Hi. The fundraising that you're doing, are the foundations that you're continuing or to solicit, are they mostly for the change and transition design, or are they environmental? And how would we know if there are conflicts with things that we're, grants that we're pursuing as well?
So it's a mix, because when we started to interview people here about, last time I was here, we talked about what are the top 3 problems in Ojai. And we got a laundry list of different things people prioritize differently. But it also gave us a whole bunch of different entry points. And so we brought that, not the entire list, but a section of that list that all kind of falls under this notion of climate resiliency, but also includes things like affordable housing, right? So some of the foundations have different entry points into the project. The list that we came up with is a mix of, there's probably some likely suspects that are large foundations you would imagine that we would be pitching, but there's also small family foundations that I frankly had never heard of that came back in this search. I think we're happy to have a discussion if there are folks that you're targeting to make sure we're not targeting the same people. Actually, Rockefeller's off the list because of, we can't pitch them because Carnegie Mellon has them as a larger level conversation. So yeah, happy to have that conversation and understand the concern there.
Last thing we want to do is bump into efforts here.
Yeah.
We're just trying to supplement.
In researching the foundations and what they wish to find when they are funding, is they're looking for organizations that are collaborative because it leverages their money. And so the synergies between organizations actually have quite an advantage in funding. And yet I understand that you can't really do that because of being a university. So if I'm understanding correctly, if Watershed Progressive was able to bring you in, we could bring you in, but you can't bring us in. Is that correct?
No, that's not exactly right.
No, so I think the issue is we have a process that we need to run that delivers what we say we can deliver. And so if we can partner with folks that are aligned with that or accomplish part of what we're trying to accomplish, that makes sense. What we can't do is bolt on partners that are doing something different or do something that endorses particular solutions before we even start the process of surfacing them. So I think what we're looking for, we're absolutely open to collaboration. I think where we tend to find ourselves in collaboration is being the host of multiple collaborators as opposed to a partner with one entity and then hosting collaboration.
Yeah, it's a university, and there's a fundraising department, and we've had several meetings with them, and it's all women again. The women in our college are very excited about this initiative, but there are, of course, guidelines that govern what we can do. If I remember correctly, anything that involves Carnegie Mellon less than 50%, you'll probably be the lead on it, remember? So it's only when Carnegie Mellon is the main player that we will have to negotiate contract by contract. But it doesn't mean we can't do it. It just means every new constellation will be talking to our fundraising department to find out what's possible. Because Cheryl is got Flip Labs, she will sometimes be the lead on these things, and Carnegie Mellon will be partnering with her. So what we're trying to do is create as much flexibility as possible. Sometimes it will be advantageous to have Carnegie Mellon's name be the attractor, but sometimes we might go in the other way through the back door. It's just my fundraising department will have to bless the thing, and that's doable.
So how are you guys going to deal with for-profit IP? Because intellectual property protection could become a real inhibitor if the money is coming through the university and it have to be a profit share of some kind through your company. So how are you guys going to deal with international property laws?
On a case-by-case basis. I mean, there's not, Carnegie Mellon doesn't own the output of these projects in terms of the ideas. They own the research that they do and the pieces of it that they talk about. Typically, the way we've handled IP for these types of initiatives, there are, first of all, at the point when a company is just getting started, there's very little typically to protect, and an idea is only worth about that much until it's executed. So NDAs are kind of, in my opinion, having worked with a lot of ventures, unnecessary until you get to a certain point.
Well, it's actually very important from a money perspective.
Can we have this conversation?
Yeah, let's take this offline. Yeah.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Hi, I'm very excited to have you guys on board. I think this is a very unique opportunity, not only for Ojai, but for the county and for the state. So really excited, and I have a ton of questions, but I'll focus them on the big picture items because I think that's where we're at in the planning stages. do you two have an idea in terms of projected length of time this whole program will take, and your expected or ideal amount of funding? And I know we're still early on, and then also wanted to hear about the top 3 issues that you mentioned were a result of the community meetings.
So the answer to the first question is we don't have that yet. We're doing project scoping right now. And typically what's going to happen is that I'm going to scope the project so that we have different options, right? There's sort of like, what's the luxury version where we have all of the bells and whistles that we would like to have, and then what would be the stripped down version we could do and not compromise the basic things we need to get out of the process. Because when we start talking to foundations, they're going to have their own missions and agendas and things that they want to accomplish. And so a lot of it is how much can you align with what they want to do. I would say that this type of project, when we've run it in the past, one cycle of it is typically 1.2 million, right? And that includes a significant chunk of the money going into the actual incubation and work that is not coming through us and is going out to the community. And your second question was about the top 3 things. I didn't really keep an ordinal list of like how many times different things appeared and which got the top ranking. Affordable housing was one that came up a lot. Short-term rentals came up a lot. Water was the top issue for folks. I'm trying to remember what no. I mean, those were things that surfaced. I think I'm trying to remember what the other one was. It was
Well, growth and tourism.
growth. That was it.
Growth.
Growth.
Growth in what aspect?
Growth, no growth, don't care. We actually had,
We actually met with somebody yesterday, and we've been doing this exercise in the smaller groups and saying, map yourself in the constellation of stakeholder groups in Ojai. And this particular individual said, well, there's 3 buckets. There's people that want growth, there's people that don't want growth, and there's people that don't care. So that view of the universe was really clear, but very, very helpful. Very helpful. I just wanted to build on, or maybe offer a counterpoint. So we completely get the urgency of the situation, and we always want to go for low-hanging fruit, and there will always be some low-hanging fruit to get tangible things done. But I will tell you, I am also interested in long horizons of time. And that is one aspect of transition design. I actually think one of the roots of wicked problems in our Western society today is we want everything done immediately. And we come up with a lot of knee-jerk reactions that have unseen, unpredictable consequences down the road. Another root of wicked problems is our mindsets and our worldview about things. So transition design is also interested in behavior change. It's interested in how we change our mindset around things like water. Because one of the things that emerged in the workshops was, paradoxically, we know that water is life, but we have this idea that it's just inexhaustible. There's always going to be plenty of it, because in our experience, you turn the tap on and the water comes. You can find examples on the planet of indigenous peoples that actually have a reverence for water. Their entire organizing idea about water is very different from ours in the West. So I'm also interested in how can a community like this, but moreover our society in the West, begin to change our concepts about things like water or things like diversity or even growth. You know, development isn't necessarily the same thing as growth. So exploring ideas like that takes a long time to change. So I'm very interested in absolutely what are the interventions, the quick win-win interventions that we can get underway in the near term and the midterm, but I'm also interested in the long game. What happens if we start to introduce some of these ideas at the primary and middle school levels? Like in 20 years, you would have a different ilk of resident in Ojai that would be behaving much differently than we do. So that's the long game. And so I think there's multiple time horizons involved, and that doesn't preclude urgency, but it says let's also plan for the next 2 or 3 generations. And I think that is what Indigenous wisdom can bring. And we're also very interested in digging into that. You know, what is some of the Indigenous wisdom that has hopefully been preserved in this region?
So Bill opened, and it's about time to close. So are there any final questions that have, someone's burning inside that just has to get it out?
I want to make a book recommendation because this group is here about water. Please read The Big Thirst by Charles Fishman. If you haven't read it, it's about how communities all over the world have dealt with the very problem we are now dealing with. And let there be water. Yeah, and being educated first is going to make a lot of difference about how this process works.
So can we give these folks a hand?
Yeah.
And we're done with comments. We're going to be here for about 10 more minutes if you'd like to say something in person or in private with them, but we're going to close the doors at 7:30. So thank you all for coming. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks, Randy.
I just wanted to say.
Watershed is going to be got to center us also.
Always knocking things over. Yeah, knocking things over. People with good jobs.
I don't know. I just want to. I'm trying to think. I love having orange groves and all the sides around my house.
We're just stuck in the drop. This problem is
That's a pretty good point. But please stay in touch. We're on the state Pleased to meet you, Bobby. Thank you for we send out notices from the
Around big
tomorrow, so sorry I staggered in late. I was gonna ask you guys to fix traffic and talk over other disciplines. No, very cool. So, before, do you have this sort of, general stuff? I've seen the, excellent. Well, have a great night. I will keep doing it later. I'll see you in 15 Thank you.
Summit. Are you together? And they were really going to talk to about that. And I asked Andy, he was going to be, he's the executive director for the I asked Andy, and it's not really, our mainstream interest. Went back and I said, yes, it is. This is